So now I'm quite intrigued with your story, because I've been looking at the notes, the bio that we have and everything.
Yeah.
And it talks about, well, I mean, they were calling you the foot whisperer, weren't they? So, I mean, I've always been a fan of the dog whisperer. That's, because of the psychology involved in that and everything. It's quite amazing
Exactly.
stuff. And I know you work in areas such as trauma and balance movement. I'm reading it from my script here. And you're a disorder, would I be right in saying a movement disorder specialist, yeah?
Yes, yes.
And the other piece which I found interesting was animating the senses and increasing biological presence. So can you explain that a bit more to us, yeah?
Oh, absolutely, and very pragmatically as well, because my background started with involvement in trauma with soldiers that had lost limbs in the military.
Right, right.
And so the whole intriguing aspect of this foot whispering name that has been festooned to me starts with the fact that I worked on feet that weren't even there. And this will relate to getting to your answer in regards to the discovery I made. So I was on the faculty at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and soldiers would come up from Fort Carson, and we were sort of the triage for what they called the head cases. So these are folks with phantom limb pain. No one could understand really how to diagnose that or how to treat it, except, heavily medicate it. And they would come into our office. I happened to be the resident medical anthropologist with a psychologist and a psychiatrist on staff. So what I did is there was a new approach developing in Southern California at University of Southern California, Davis, I believe. No, San Diego, sorry. We're using mirror reflex technique. And so what we started to do was use the mirror reflex technique to have the brain look at what pathways were truncated or what trauma had been created in the presence of this pain, and started to define pain as just simply information and have the person work backwards. The interesting discovery, though, I had was the pain resolution, the memory, the template was much more severe for soldiers that had been ambulatory, meaning they had been walking or standing, versus the ones that had been lying down or sitting when they lost their limb, when they lost their lower extremity. So going back to my Gray's Anatomy, I looked at a model called the Homunculus. Now, for those who are not familiar with this model, they may be familiar with the vision of it, the image of it. And that is a naked body standing there in front of you with the concentration of the nerves displayed as physical parts. So in other words, you've got an individual standing and they have very large protruding lips, because that's our highest concentration of nerve endings in our body are around our lips. And you can trace why very quickly. These concentration of nerves are vital for survival. And then you'll see a very large set of hands, and then a moderate sized set of genitals, and then normalized foot size. That was not what I was seeing in reality. What I was seeing in reality was that was a model, a static model of someone that would actually be sitting down, not standing up. So now we have to take in a little bit of the concentration of what's going on with the body's energy flow. So now we're coming back to sensory animation and the spatial, meaning working in space, movement in space connection. So are you following me on this?
I am, yeah. And there's a definite difference between the two, yeah?
Yes. So, but what's interesting is in our Western medical text, we were simply having the homunculus be a model that existed out there, but wasn't really practical. Partially because they didn't believe in it, and also because it wasn't dynamic. So what happened was, when we're sitting down, and anyone that works on you that has to do intricate things with their hands, surgeon, hairstylist, dental hygienist, foot whisperer, they will be sitting down when they touch you, because that's when your hands are very sensitive. They're very large.
Right.
When I do a presentation for special needs populations, I'll literally have these big Mickey Mouse hands behind my back and then pull them out. And I'll say, this is what my hands look like sitting down. When I sit down, I'll then display to them what happens. Our hands shrink down to normal size. 70% of the information for our balance and movement comes from our knee and below to our feet the moment we stand up.
Right.
We have big Donald Duck feet.
And that's happening inside our brains, if you like, or how would you describe that?
Yes, actually, yeah, well, the best way to understand it is to look into what's going on in traditional Asian, Oriental, Chinese medicine basis, where we have a 24-hour circadian cycle.
Yeah,
that's
I know,
moving our energy through the organs. But that's also happening, that's sort of like a macroeconomic process of keeping our organism healthy and balanced and alive. The micro element of this is how we move in time and space. And because we're doing that, that's really what's happening, is our energy is being shifted around consistently.
Yeah.
And when I'm working on someone, I need to understand how that energy is flowing, especially in a trauma situation. And in this particular case, what we did to validate this information is I was presenting at the largest weekend conference in the state of Florida for anyone with a special needs concern. If you're living with one, or you have a family member of one, you're a caregiver for one, you can come to this conference for free. It's in the middle of June every year. So I highly recommend people that live in Florida become aware of that, because it's an amazing 160 different workshops.
Right.
But what we were able to do is we were able to work with Down syndrome children. And what we did was we would blindfold them. And the reason we worked with Down's children is because they will tell you, there is no filter. They will tell you what they feel instantly.
Right.
So what we did,
so more so than, ordinary children or whatever, they are you saying they're more of a feeling being as such? Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And in our case, they're even more of a model for us, because one of the things that happens with Downs is a truncation, a shortening of the toes, and a delay in balance and walking.
All right.
And one of the things that happens is when you can intervene and create a process to get them balanced and walking sooner, you can actually improve cognitive ability.
So one relates to the other.
Yes. And so we have all of this coming together. And what we would do is we would have these young children, they would be blindfolded, and they could tell the difference sitting down between salt, sugar, and sand granules in their hand. When they stood up blindfolded, they could no longer make that distinction.
So there's a shift in some way.
Yes. And so the shift into the feet, what we did is we had a little plate, and irregardless of the weight that was delivered into the foot, we would simply have them move their feet over top of it while they were sitting, and then deliver the same amount of weight over top of it while they were standing, and they would tell us which one hurt more.
And so you're saying that's common in all human beings, though, that ability. But is it heightened in the syndrome, in Down syndrome, or is that where we're going with that?
Well, in this case, it is common. It's a common process because of our bilateral movement, because we have to stand up and balance and move. But in the case of Down's children, we were looking at their lack of filter. A lot of people rationalize, well, you're telling me this should feel this way, or, I'm not sure I feel this way. They'll tell us directly. The other thing is, because they are they're a technically balanced, challenged population from this get-go, we literally are able to do this kind of work with them and see very effective progress. So that's what's exciting about that. And that's what got me thinking in the process of what's going on with Parkinson's. And Parkinson's is, people with Parkinson's are about 50% of my client base. And you'll understand the reasoning behind this, because what happens, it's defined as a balance and movement disorder condition. But once you start taking the medications to handle a lot of the symptom response that's actually socially registered, the tremors and things like that, and the drooling, the teetering with the balance, it starts to cause the lymphatic system to become arrested, slow down, and it stiffens up the feet, literally turns the feet into blocks of wood. This is vital for our lymphatic flow, to have the feet flexing, and it's vital, as I just described, for our balance, to have all of this response in our feet when we're moving. We take so much of this for granted until you actually have an issue where you're losing this ability. So in the case of massive amounts of synthetic dopamine that are taken, and this stiffening of the feet, you're literally putting someone into a 1/3 likelier fall situation when they lose sensitivity in their feet, which we also see in diabetic neuropathy. So when I'm dealing with diabetes and I'm dealing with neuropathy, one, you have to be very tricky in this situation, because if you put too much pressure into a foot with neuropathy, it's going to, as you know, it's going to burn and it's going to hurt. So I had to come into this with different bioenergetic platforms, and I'm an innovator, so I just look and see what's going to work for someone. And in this case, what I found is I do magnetic massages on the diabetic foot and bring a lot of relief to the neuropathy and sensation back into those nerve endings, which is also pretty fascinating when you think about it.
But I mean, you know, when we look at that area in particular, it's kind of assumed that you kind of just get that if you've got diabetes, and a kind of an eventual thing that's going to occur in some cases. Yeah. But are you saying that it's not just about the feet, in a sense that the feet will affect everything else, or whatever, you know, other issues within the body? And so, because, you know, I could never understand why some people do get it and some people don't get it, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, and there are plasticity elements to that in terms of refining what's going on with nerve signaling. And then there's also elements that are involved in the body's ability to, I'm not going to say a neurogenesis process in that area of the body, but where other nerve endings can be co-opted. And what we've been able to find, for example, where I've got a case of complete numbness at the end of the toe ends, when I create a bridge with the magnets, we're able to actually have sensation come back into the tip of the toe with the magnets augmenting that. So what we're doing is we're bridging, in this case, from a common practice. What's happening is, to relate to your question, Gary, it's really interesting, because one of the things that happens with Parkinson's also is the loss of fingerprint pattern to pick up paper or move sheets. And people wonder why that's occurring. And I can see you nodding. It's a very interesting process, because one of the things that we find, and this is a great example of a perfect healing paradox. So you can take a ton of lather, suntan lotion, whatever, put it on your hands and rub it on someone else, and it doesn't penetrate through your skin. Yet if you close your eyes and just touch your fingertips, it's one of the most sensitive areas on the whole body, highly concentrated with nerve endings and pores. How does that lotion not get into your skin? You ever wonder about that?
Yeah, this is like a science beyond a science, isn't it, if you like? Well, there's probably a better word for that, but you're really digging deep, aren't you, in that sense?
Well, in this sense, I have to, because a lot of times what we're doing is the highest concentration, other than the top of our head, with sweat gland pores are, you probably guess it knowing where I work on the body. You know,
no, you'll have to enlighten me on that one.
The bottom of the feet.
All right, of course, yeah.
Yeah. And so these areas are where the body can access. And a lot of people, when I'm first talking to them, they don't understand that on their feet, they have toe prints just like their handprints. So here we have this sensitivity process. And one of the things that happens with Parkinson's and a high concentration of medications to handle these tremors and these stimulations is we actually start to lose the grooves in the fingerprint patterns as a protective factor for the body. The body says, you know what, we can no longer be so sensitive because we literally have to protect we have to focus our energy inward.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's on a meta level. That's kind of where we're getting to with spatial and bioenergetic processes.
Yeah, I could give you quite a few cases for you to diagnose, because it seems like I'm surrounded by different things. You know, I mean, my son was born spina bifida.
Yes.
And, you know, he's been a very lucky man now, because he's about, 30 something. And, you know, originally when he was born, they said he would never walk, but he defied them and got up and decided to walk, and has done ever since. But now that he's getting up into that kind of age, he's losing control, you know, in the bowel area and also in one of his feet. So he drags his foot now, you see. So it'd be interesting to think, you know, to find out what your kind of diagnosis would be around those kinds of problems.
And actually, you're hitting right into the wheelhouse. I just worked on an individual who had been in a helicopter crash 26 years ago. They wanted to amputate. He was the only survivor of this 4-person crew crash. They wanted to amputate his foot because it was basically just being held on by the skin.
Yeah.
He managed to preserve not having his foot removed. And now he encounters me some quarter of a century later. And the interesting thing is, I first started doing the way I do the diagnostics are also very important to understand, because I can quickly tell whether the work that I'm going to leverage is going to be beneficial or not. If I don't get the kind of response that I need from the pulses in the body. And so when I'm looking at a situation where, and a lot of times we do have spinal issues going on with this for sure. And there's some amazing advances that are moving us in a direction using much less intrusive light energy tools to do these kinds of processes once we understand what's lacking in the connections between, say, the spine and which area in the foot. But one of the things in this case was I will use and this is very, very simple and extremely accessible. I always laugh when I show up, because I do a lot of residential treatments too. And I'll literally show up with a basket with all my goodies in it for the treatments. And then I'll show up with a bucket and I'll say, I can work on your feet or I can wash your car. And the reason I have this bucket is it's an ashiyu. It's at a Japanese foot spa.
Right.
And what I do is I immerse their feet in the foot spa at a level that is mid-calf, because there's a point on the leg when the body is submerged to that point, the brain thinks the whole body's in this water. So for about 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to be looking for a flushing reaction. I'm going to ask them about the temperature in the air. And so I'm going to pick up their feedback. And then what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect. And I get this when I work with professional athletes, and especially the tennis players. And they'll be there for their feet, and I'll reach up and I'll put my hand on their kneecap and go into a point behind the knee, which is and they'll say this to me, they'll go, why are you at my knee? My foot's the problem. And I'll go, I'm checking your spatial connection with your brain. And of course, I'll get this massively puzzled look from them. And I'll go, well, wait a minute. I said, have you ever heard of the notion of going weak in the knees when you get strong emotional news, or you're a boxer and you get hit in the jaw and you lose your knees?
Yeah.
I said, what's going on with that? What do the knees have to do with emotion?
That expression actually is fascinating, that we do have those very, very old expressions that seem to mean something, don't they?
And in this case, the knee will tell me, because part of it is how the knee functions with the brain. So if the brain does not want the body to move, because the brain is always going to do what it needs to do to preserve its position. It does not want to hit the ground, essentially, in most basic terms. It will lock up the knee. You go nowhere if your knees are locked up. So that's the situation that we're experiencing. But what I want to know is how much of that is psychologically present. Also, how much is being demanded of each leg in this process, so I can tell whether one knee is working more than the other. Now, I come in behind the knee and I don't get the pulse point. I don't feel the heart beating. Then I start to transition down to the feet, and I will touch the feet in the water first. A lot of people wonder why I don't pull the feet out. When we go into this water, our sensitivity in our fingertips becomes 3 times higher. So when I reach into the water, I take a pulse off of the radial on the top of the foot, which now people aren't aware of this either. There are 2 different pulses, but again, I'll give you another old saying. You got cold feet, huh? You getting a little nervous about this? You getting a little anxious?
Yeah.
That is the heart pulse in the foot. There's also a brain pulse in the foot, and they're very distinct from each other. So the brain pulse is at the femoral artery on the ankle, and that's the pulse that we learn from our medical practice to always check first, most reliable pulse in the body. Because again, we are hardwired at birth for balance. So our brain is plugged into our feet the moment we're born, because there's a reflex test. And an infant cannot move their pinky finger voluntarily until 6 months after birth. The Babinski reflex done on the bottom of the foot at birth shows the little baby toe reaches way out and curls right in. It's a reflex that's integrated. And guess what spot on a reflexology chart shows the inner ear? It's right next.
I know that point. I'm very familiar with that. In tapping, we use that. We call it the gamuts box. It covers lots of different things. Accumulation of different things. Yeah.
So I'm checking to see. So when I come onto that femoral pulse, that ankle pulse, I go back up behind the knee. If I'm supporting the knee, I should get a pulse in both of those positions. If I don't, they're going to be referred, because no matter what I do, there's a psychological block that's going to prevent me from advancing with them.
And I do wonder with my son in particular whether there is some kind of psychological thing happening, because I mean, you were saying earlier that, especially with people that have been in war and lost limbs, and they're sensing that they still have that limb.
Yes.
But my son has got a foot that he doesn't feel anymore, like it's kind of not there, and that's why he can't walk efficiently, because it's like the foot doesn't exist. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, that's where, and in this case, I'll go back to the soldier that had survived a helicopter crash. He was now at a point where he had stood on a brace on a ladder on both feet, but the bad foot started showing the trauma again. And when I worked on him, I found out that his good foot had actually been laboring for so long, for so many years, that it was showing more degradation, more damage than his injured foot.
That's strange, isn't it? Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? And his brain knew that. And what was very interesting was I showed him the circulation responses. So what I do is I go, there's it's a sort of a double hit here, because I'm able to go on the pituitary point on the big toe and press into that, which is just right in the center of the big toe underneath, and press in and then release, and I can see capillary return. I can see how quickly does the red go back to a normal flesh tone again. And in his case, I showed him, I said, your foot that you nearly lost, that you were so vehement to preserve, it has fantastic circulation in it. I said, it's a highly circulating foot as far as your brain is concerned. I said, really, that's why you've had good opportunities with this foot. But I said, now the other foot, and I showed him, I pressed on the capillary return. I showed him the white splotches that were in there. I said, there's been a sacrifice made here. I said, this foot
so
now.
like sympathetic in a way.
Yes.
Is that to do with the balance?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because he literally said to me, so I said, I'm going to go into this point on the inner ear on this side. I can feel contaminate in there. And I said, I'm going to work this, and it's going to clear the inner ear duct. And sure enough, he said he felt it pop. I also instructed him, I said, there's 26 bones. A quarter of the bones in the body are in the feet. And I said, when they did this surgical reattachment, there's some bones missing in this foot. And I said, so you've got an adaptation. And one of the things that he discovered when I first went in there was he heard a pop. We both heard this loud pop, and it vibrated in the water. And then what I did for him was, and that's the thing, these kinds of processes, because they're dynamic, you have to move to heal in these situations. I provided him with yet another amazing thing from Japan. That's what's cool about Japanese, is they do have a very nice sense of how to work with the feet. And so I gave him a little piece of bamboo. It's a half shell of bamboo called a takifumi, which just means step on bamboo.
Okay.
It's like take, T-A-K-E.
Bamboo for everything, I think, there, isn't it?
F-U-M-I. Yeah, and the interesting thing about this was, again, we had to get past the myths that are rampant with these being tools used by the samurai.
Oh, right.
And they were. And that's why what these soldiers were doing is they were marching. They were on foot patrol all the time. If they couldn't engage in their foot patrol, they would be left behind. They would lose their jobs.
Right.
And they discovered that when they went into the bamboo groves, if they cut a piece of bamboo of a certain size that fit in, and that's the beauty of it, it fits right into the arch of the foot. They would peel off the skin. Now, bamboo has a very interesting feature in terms of how it functions. It grows extremely quickly and is a sponge for infrared.
Right.
So the silica in the fiber, and I'm describing this because this happens to be a very simple way to access for your son, as an example, how to stimulate responses in the skin and the feet. You've seen the athletes use a type of tape now, colored tape that you'll see on the arms and the shoulders.
Yeah.
Kinesiology taping. That groove, that weave that's in that tape, it comes from the bamboo weave of wood. So all you have to do is take a piece of bamboo and start massaging your skin, and it will be an anti-inflammatory. It's going to raise the skin just a little bit.
Right. So is that similar to, say, the foot massages that you can buy, the wooden ones and things like that, where you run your foot over the top of the thing? No, not the same.
No.
You're dealing with the arch. Is that right?
Well, we're dealing with the arch, and we're dealing with skin surface contact.
Okay.
So when you run your feet over those massage tools, they're just they're moving metabolite, accumulation of uric acid and things like that out of the bamboo is actually dynamically, it's best to actually describe it the way the Japanese do in the traditional household, is they have a hole on it, so they have a little twine that allows them to hook it on the door.
Right, as and when you need it, like.
Well, what they do, what they do is when they leave in the morning, they hang it on the door. When they come home at night, of course, when they open the door, they hear the clunk of it. They take off their shoes, entering the traditional Japanese household, and they do a process that literally translates as civilizing the foot again. So in the Japanese culture, walking around with shoes on is considered uncivilized. Yeah. Being barefoot. So now this process that they do, I call it the ant march. They just simply put the bamboo down and they spread their toes and they march across it in little 1.5 centimeter increments until their heels come just over the crest of this half piece of bamboo, and then they go back and they do this 5 times. And an ode take fume, which means to correct the foot.
So is that like walking sideways, or how would you describe that?
It's no, it's actually walking. So you walk directly over it, just like that,
Right.
and then walk back.
So the complete foot. Then,
So complete foot. Yeah.
Right. Right.
And because it has the silica and the fiber in the bamboo, it's important to do this barefoot. No, you need in contact.
Yeah.
And you only need to do this 5 times back and forth. And so that's one of the techniques that I introduced this soldier to. I said, here's your 2 pieces of bamboo. Put one in the freezer, heat one up with whatever infrared source you have. Do not use a microwave. It'll break down the cellulose.
Right.
Bamboo. But I said, put it on a window. He was in Florida. I said, put it in the windows or put it in the
It's hot in Florida,
yeah. Or get yourself a little infrared pad and put it on it. And I showed him. I had a little pad. I let it absorb infrared for 10 minutes, and I gave him a massage around the neck with it. And he was astounded at how simple this process was. And that's, I said, that's animating of the senses as well. And one of the reasons, for example, when you start to trace back, people come to me with Parkinson's, and they'll come with a concern with the tremor, with essential tremor, which is a little different than Parkinson's tremor, but the tremor origin is very similar. And I'll say, well, why do you think you're tremoring? And they'll go, I've been to so many endocrinologists and I've been to neurologists, and they've never asked me that question. I go, it's pretty interesting to think about. And I'll say, well, what is Parkinson's as a balance and move? How did it become a balance and movement disorder designation? Well, tremor, we have to go back to a model in Japan. And I was recently reminded, just to digress for a moment, to a movie called Concussion with William Smith. And when he first approached a couple of the professionals in the medical field, he was using animal models. Do you remember that? He was using the woodpecker and the ram. And he came from Nairobi. And so he knew animal models. Right. But he was talking to Western practitioners that immediately relegated that to, we're talking about human beings. What do you mean?
Yeah, that's a different world.
Yeah. And so when we're looking at, there's a dwarf Japanese flying squirrel. These little tiny squirrels perch on twigs, on branches, just like birds. They have a very stable base, but they have very, very elongated fingers and hands, and they will sit literally like this on the branch. They look like they're meditating.
Like a little bat.
Yeah, like a little bat. And then they'll reach out for whatever they want to grab. Well, the interesting thing is they have to maintain perfect balance. And what they do is they make this contact with their hands to maintain the focus on the feet. And we use this example with surfers. If you watch surfers, when they're surfing forward, they always have their hands spread way out for balance. Yeah. When they surf backwards, if they're surfing backwards, their hands immediately go down right beside them. And there was a recent Volvo commercial with Claude Van Damme, the famous split that he does. And this Volvo truck commercial had him moving, but most people didn't realize until afterwards that he was moving backwards. The trucks were actually going in reverse and spreading out to have him in that maximum position. Do you recall that commercial?
Yeah, I think I remember that, yeah.
Well, do you remember where his hands were?
No, I wouldn't have remembered that. No.
They were tucked just like this.
Right.
Locked in place.
Yeah.
He was balancing. The reason I bring that up is because what happens with the tremor is if I don't know, if I've lost the neurological connection. So in your son's case, he's lost some neurological connection between his foot and his
through the spine in some way, and all of that. Spine. Yeah.
One of the ways that you can identify exactly where your body parts are to have them signaling you constantly, no matter where they go in time and space. Yeah. That's where the tremor comes from. Right. So once we implement some of these very simple processes, we start to see symptom response that starts to lessen the brain's concern about where body parts are.
Yeah, this is a question actually I sort of wrote down earlier on, but what can people do for themselves, say, to help in, say, a situation like Parkinson's and that kind of area?
Well, that's one of the areas where I get into with this engagement with the stimulation for the feet, because when you have that amount of stimulation lost because of the medications, and here's the real kicker with this. After I do those pulse checks on the feet, the other thing that I want to check is how is the lymphatic pump working for the body? And most people are completely clueless about, we know the heart pumps blood, but we are not often educated in how lymph flows around the body.
Yeah, are they like what you'd call like our rubbish bins, where everything's kind of dumped, or how would you put that?
Well, yeah, they're going, gravity is going to circulate things down there. And I'm glad you brought that up, Gary, because there's another element to this story that should be of high concern to people. And we have a good grasp on it here in Europe, but in the US, the issue of contrast MRIs and gadolinium, the heavy metal contrast that's used in the body as an agent, is also causing a lot of collateral nerve damage around the body.
Right.
And shutting the kidneys down, because what we're doing with the feet, and oftentimes I'll say this to people, I'll say, okay, to understand the lymphatic pumping of the foot and its process systemically in the body, all you have to do is get a hold of the big toe and start to gradually move it up. So if you have a foot here, I'm just moving the big toe up, and I'm looking at how the plantar connection of the tendon is near the heel of the foot. And I'm seeing which foot is doing more pumping action, and it'll go up to the opposite kidney to vacate the contaminant that's in the feet as it's pumping lymphatic fluid around the body. So once you start losing the capacity to flex your feet, that's why I also get cosmetic kinds of issues where someone is coming to me and they want a correction on a toe deformation, a bunion is predominantly the case. And I'll say this is much more than cosmetic, because that big toe is your handle. That is the handle of the pump of the lymphatic system.
Right.
So the further it goes towards the middle of the foot, in the case of a bunion, or in the case of surgical interventions, try to correct the bunion, recidivism rate with bunions is tremendously high.
Mm-hmm.
You already shorten the big toe when you do that surgery.
Right.
So what we're doing is I'm using a process of having people walk on the bamboo and walk on a stone mat. I also make a stone mat available to people. And the stone mat is something that's been prevalent in the gardens in Asian cultures for thousands and thousands of years. And the way they use them is very intuitive to how the body heals. So they'll walk and they'll see an area on the foot that will cause some sensation, and they will focus on that area for the next couple days, and then go back and walk again and see if it's still painful or not, or if it still has that stimulation in it.
Yeah.
And the way I like to help people understand this part of it, because I'll have folks that will walk on the mat. Their feet have been so conditioned to shoes that they're extremely sensitive to anything that's coming in there. So they've been riding on cushions for a long, long time. So they actually have not been pumping effectively as well. And what I'll do is I'll have them first. This is a great capstone example of spatial awareness and sensory animation. I'll have them walk forward on the mat, registering what does this feel like for their feet? How much stimulation, how much sensation is there? And they'll accuse me of torturing them. And
you just want their soft shoes back.
And they want their shoes back, and I'll show them how we can put a towel down there and soften the blow a little bit. But then I'll have them walk. I use GPS as a nomenclature way to have them understand the simple process of walking with the toes out and then walking with the toes in, and then walking sideways so that they will hit each pressure point on the foot. Then what I'll do, and it's always the last step, I'll have them walk backwards on the stones. I'll then ask them, I'll go, so walking forward on the stones, or I'll have them repeat, walking forward, and then I'll say, now walk backwards on it again. I'll say, which one of those you felt more stimulation into the feet with? And they'll go, you mean pain? And I'll go, well, that's what you're defining as, but they'll walk backwards on the stones. They'll feel much less stimulation.
Right.
It won't hurt as much. And I'll go, well, why would that be the case? And the interesting thing here is to understand we have 3 balance centers in our body. Our main balance center is our eyes.
Right.
I have to work a lot with the eyes and visual acuity and peripheral vision response, and even some eye movement desensitization for trauma. I will have them move forward, and they're using their eyes as their main balance center. They start moving backwards, they can no longer use their eyes. So the brain says, oh, that information that was just coming through the feet as you're walking forward that was hurting me, now it's purely information. It's information I need. So I've redefined that nerve pathway flow. And it is very...
Yeah. And I think this is why, I mean, we've got computers and things like that now, haven't we? And really the human brain, and not just the brain, but like you were talking about, all the other connections and everything else, the way the body's interlinked all round in so many different ways that you're discovering as well.
Yeah.
A computer could never, a robot, if you like, could never get to be a human being in that respect, So there's so much, isn't there, to that?
Yes, yes.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say to you, actually, then, does that really mean that just going for a walk is so important?
Yes. And I have ended so many Parkinson's presentations with just move it, move it, move it, literally. And again, we go back to all of those interconnections and all those linkages. And one of the things that surprises people about when I start talking about the bottom of the feet right up to the top of the head, and I'll say, okay, well, here's an interesting thing to look at with the hips, because one of the conditions, and that's the thing about certain medications that are taken, is they do things, of course, dry mouth. Dry mouth is a really good indication that your lymphatic system is being severely challenged. Because when I can't get to the feet, to flex the feet for lymphatic response, I will have to go to the saliva gland set. There's 3 saliva glands in the throat and in the jaw. And one of the things that happens is when you walk on that stone mat, this is the evidence that a lot of people, and by the way, this particular tool has gone through the gold standard double-blind trial. It does 3 things: improves balance, flexibility, and interestingly enough, also modulates diastolic blood pressure. And a lot of people will say, well, how could stones in the feet do that? Well, as soon as you start walking on the stones, you'll notice your mouth goes dry. The reason being is, as you know, Gary, you start stimulating things in the garbage can in the bottom of the feet. Those toxins have to go somewhere, and they come up, and the kidneys need to pull fluid to process. So the kidneys will immediately come up and start drawing from our reservoir. This is literally our water stem cells.
Right.
It can go anywhere in the body to do protective sorts of things. Now people wonder where does the fluid for swelling come from? It comes from the saliva glands. So in this case, drying up the saliva glands with medication is actually one of the worst things that can happen to somebody. And one of the conditions with Parkinson's, as an example, is drooling. I'll literally show them. I'll say, rather than take, and I'm not saying that they're going to go off a levodopa dopamine schedule, But I'm going to say you're going to be able to adjust this once the body's lymphatic system starts functioning better. And I'll show them how to milk and sequence their saliva glands so that they can have a conversation for 15 or 20 minutes and not be drooling.
Right,
Because
right.
we already know that 50% of Parkinson's symptom response is anxiety induced. There's a thing called freeze gait where the foot freezes. Freeze gait occurs most likely between the thresholds of a room or a doorway.
Right.
So there you see right there indication of how powerful anxiety can be in this process. And so there we are with this process where we're simply moving people through an awareness so that they can stimulate different areas in the body themselves and do these kinds of healing processes.
Yeah, yeah.
Constipation is another one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much that we could talk about today. I mean, this is incredible, what the work that you're doing there. Are you training other people in doing this? Is that possible to do that?
Yes, yes. There's a certain level of sensitivity that some people have and other people just don't have that is required for this. But I have a few simple processes that we go through to see if someone can have that sensitivity level, especially around magnetic energy. And I use some tools that constantly keep, my son was with me one time where I was doing some work, and there was an aha moment for him when he realized that I was constantly holding this pulse magnetic field tool that I was delivering to other people in the foot. And then he went, "That's why you have that sensitivity in your hands." And I said, "Well, yeah," I said, "it is constantly keeping the blood spread and the polarity response in the hands fresh."
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that people can be trained on, and the processes that we go through. Where we're going right now with this is very exciting because we're moving more towards less practitioner intervention and more of the bioenergetic field responses that we're discovering. So one of the things is light, and being able to stimulate the body with light in different ways. I'm particularly focused a lot on the intranasal cavity because there are openings and fissures in the intranasal cavity that allow us to get into the brain. And the olfactory bulb in these cells that are in the brain connected to smell are the only cells in the brain that do perform neurogenesis. They regrow.
This sounds like another interview, doesn't it? This one.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why. Because and this has only been really uncovered.
Yeah.
In the last 4 years with the lymphatic.
Right. So it's all fresh and new
Yeah.
in that respect. Well, Randy, I hope we're going to do the Living Energy Day again. And hopefully you'll come back and update us even more, in these different areas, because it's quite amazing what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Can somebody follow you up in some way? Is there somewhere they can go to see, what you're doing in the future, etc.?
Yeah, probably the best way. I am pretty social mediated, so there are pages out there on Facebook that I maintain and update. One of them is pineal, so it's the pineal gland.
Yeah, yeah.
Another one is foot. Jokingly, it's called foot whisperado.
Right.
Because that's a name that some people have tagged me with. My name, Randy Eady, and then I do have a website called Soul to Soul.
I think I looked at that when I researched. Yeah.
Yeah, and the therapy that we're implementing is called Ancient Walking to Primal Rhythms.
Right. Hopefully people can write this down at home, so they can follow you in that respect. But I'm certainly been enlightened, and I've got like 1,000 questions here that I want to ask you, and more questions than that, I would imagine, because of what we've been talking about. It always picks up the next question, doesn't it, in that respect? And like I say, I've got a whole host of case histories here that you could deal with, so including myself. Very, very briefly, how are you with like other things like acupuncture and that kind of stuff?
I'm looking always at complementary components, and because acupuncture derives from acupressure, we're really looking at, I will answer this question though, and that's regard. With Parkinson's, again, I hate to go back just to Parkinson's, but that being the wheelhouse, and acupuncture is a really good example because there's a efficiency with improving electrical flow in the body with acupuncture. Parkinson's happens to be an electrical dysrhythmia.
Right.
So when you get acupuncture with Parkinson's, you're going to exacerbate symptom response because it's going to reinforce that dysrhythmia. It's very different than something like multiple sclerosis where you have that neurological disconnect that can be very effectively focused on with acupuncture.
Right, right.
So I'm constantly looking at complementing what I'm doing with nutrition and functional medicine models as well. And I'm not a nutritionist, so what I do is I always look for the experts in that area that can help me out. Right. And my basis, because of my background with the military, does involve a lot of photonics. So that's how I come into light and understand frequencies and wavelengths and processes of light in the body. And so that gets me into that area where we are doing much more light-induced therapy.
Right. So it'd be interesting to see when, what the results of all that are as you progress with that. So, but I'm going to have to love you and leave you, as they say.
Sure, I understand.
It's been quite an amazing day, really, all the different things that are coming along. And hopefully I've got Katharina, who's going to be on in just a second. We're all fighting the technical stuff. Yeah, there she is. Okay. Yeah, and as I say, thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm going to take away some of that information and work on my son with that as well. So
great.
If he's open to doing it, obviously.
Right.
It's an alternative kind of thing, isn't it? So see what happens. But I'd love to talk to you more if in some way maybe we can touch base in that way.
Absolutely, because there's a couple other things advancing that I'd love to share.
Yeah. Well, you've shared a great deal here, so thank you for doing that for us. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for hosting this, Gary. It's great.
All right. Yeah, and have a fantastic day where you are. Yeah.
You too, and that's with Katharina next.
Yes.
Okay,
Katharina, if you could unmute yourself there.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks, Randy. That was really interesting. It's so fascinating to see all the different aspects and how everybody knows how to link it in and gives a different direction and a different insight into the way that the body works on all these different levels is absolutely fab. And Gary and Randy, I bought some shoes, the toe shoes from you.
That's right. We didn't even get into the fashion of toe shoes.
Yeah, no. I think I should walk barefoot to go and do some shopping now. What do you think? Do you think that will help or not?
Well, and that's the thing. People will say to me, "Oh, you're an advocate of the toe shoes." And I'll go, "No, I'm an advocate of bare feet." Yeah. Whatever gets closest to that is what I'll go for. But Katharina, I do not argue with fashion, so I've learned my lesson there. Women will wear high heels.
You know what? I think it's I was recently. She was wearing them, and it brought a smile to people's faces. So I think that, in a way, is already a very. That's already a very. Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, we want to have some smiles in the world,
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'll let you go then, and I'll be listening in.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yep.
Thanks. Gary, thank you also very much.
That's all right. I'm back at 7 o'clock.